Any man in today's day and age who criticizes feminism will be accused of things like misogyny, toxic masculinity, being an incel, and so on. And I thought I'd talk in this video about why this happens from my own experience as somebody who has gathered millions of views, particularly on TikTok, but cross-platform, from being very critical of feminism amongst multiple other ideologies and religious belief systems. But there are certain ones that always get more of a backlash and are particularly prone to thinking that they're immune from criticism, and feminism is one of these. And I thought I'd say as well, it's obviously not a pleasant thing to have when you know at your core that you genuinely aren't a misogynist, and you know that this isn't what the girls and women in your life, your true friends, think of you and what they know of you. But it's gonna happen anyway. It's an inevitable thing, particularly for anyone who does men's content, men's promotional stuff. Like, I'll give you an example of this. It's very common if I meet women that I say I'm a men's coach, and they say, well, why don't you coach women? But you would never have that if you're a woman's coach. Well, why don't you coach men? You know, it's this double standard with the way things are looked at, and that double standard is often not understood and appreciated because the society we've grown up in is so female biased at this point, but painted as being patriarchal and the other way. But let's dig into why this happens. So at the core of it, I'd say the main thing I've noticed with feminists in today's day and age is its ego underlying it, which might seem like an obvious observation, and it does underpin the other two factors. But feminism, particularly woke feminism, is very much a religious belief system. You have your scripts, you have your leaders, your thought leaders at the top, and most of the people I see that are buying into it, they're not really coming at it from a logical position. It's generally an emotionally invested and dogmatic position that they come from, which is why it can be very, very difficult to have polite and rational conversation with contemporary feminists, or to actually get through to them, because much like religious people, the basis for their beliefs comes down to faith, and they feel at their core that they know the ultimate truth, and you cannot disprove them with that. But they don't even recognize that they look at it that way. They don't realize that it is the new religion. And this isn't a new perspective at all in today's day and age. With the decline of traditional religion, we found people identifying with other groups, and wokeism and all forms of woke ideologies, whether it be the critical race theories, the contemporary trans lobby, the feminists, they are religious groups in the way they go about things. They are zealous and often very controlling in the same way that a lot of religions operate, particularly the monotheistic Abrahamic religions and cults as well. If you look at that, like the way that they try to shut down opposition and control people from within, and there's often some very narcissistic people leading these groups as well. Jonathan Haidt has spoken about this, and there's a lot of research that shows higher rates of narcissism, sociopathy, and even I think psychopathy. I stand to be corrected on this, but even I think psychopathy with a lot of people that buy into these radical ideologies, and wokeism is no stranger to that. But these people, because they identify so closely their own sense of self with this ideology, when you criticize the ideology, it becomes a criticism of themselves, and it threatens their whole identity when you challenge what they believe, particularly when it's so deeply embedded in this sense of virtuousness and self-righteousness, which is what you see with most left-wing ideologies. And again, you do get it with right religious groups, but the contemporary left in particular seems to be like that, and modern feminism is very much like that. So you get these very vitriolic and emotionally loaded responses when you try to deal with people who, or discuss or explore ideas with people who are buying into this ideology. And with that, the second point is the fear element. So there is that fear of being disproved, but also I would say with a lot of feminists, from what I've seen, there's this fear of men that underlies it. And I think both men and women are afraid of each other in different ways. Men are afraid of women because women tend to wield much more emotional power over men. Men obviously have the physical superiority there, but the vast majority of men are not going to overpower a woman because they know that that is inherently wrong and they will be punished severely for it. And there's the hierarchy in the prison system, for example, if you see that with the girl beaters and so on. If that does happen, men do obviously have that, in some ways, that ultimate power, in that, yeah, they can cause the most physical damage, but women have the emotional upper hand there, and that leads to men being afraid of what women can do, and particularly when it comes to intimacy and their sense of self-esteem and wanting to win the approval of women. And you can look at this from evolutionary psych perspectives in terms of the probability of men procreating being lower than women, and this influences the male sex drive differences, etc., etc. But women do have that upper hand there, and it leads to men being afraid of women. But women are afraid of men in the same way, or a lot of them are, because of that potential for men to overpower. And unfortunately, because there are a minority of men who commit heinous acts against women, and again, unfortunately, a lot of women, when you speak to them, have had negative experiences with these guys who, in the most part, are responsible for the vast majority of these offences. It's a tiny group of men that commit the most responsibility, that commit most of these acts. However, contemporary feminism, particularly Me Too feminism, like to paint this idea that men as a whole are complicit with this. There's this terrible graph I've seen before that challenges the not all men claim that people have said before, where it essentially draws out the tiny minority of men who commit offences, and then implies that it's only a tiny minority of men who stand against it, and that the vast majority of men are complicit and in support, or they don't say anything about it. And it completely overlooks male heroism and the fact that men, in the most part, are very protective of women. And obviously there's far less coverage and reporting of men who do things to protect women from danger, whether it be from other men, other women, or animals, or things going wrong, who knows, like cars crashing, natural disasters. If you look at the number of cases of men who've died saving women from fires or from drowning, these kind of things, right, that gets completely overlooked. But modern feminism, particularly Me Too, it paints the illusion that men are offenders in the most part, or complicit with it, and it created this environment for women where they're essentially told that they need to live in fear, that men need to cross the road when they're walking, like you need to be looking over your shoulder all of the time, that men are completely dangerous. And that clearly rubs off negatively in the say it's disempowering, right? It isn't elevating and empowering. It's not empowering women, it's terrifying them. And it's the same thing with the critical race theories, where it was essentially painted that if you're black or non-white, you are at a disadvantage and you can't do anything about it. And this is the whole problem with woke ideologies as a whole, is they do disempower people to see themselves as predetermined and that they can't do anything. And that also then leads to this entitlement, which is the third point, because contemporary feminism paints, being influenced by wokeism in particular, it paints everything in the binary divide of the oppressor and the oppressed. And the oppressed group are seen as inherently more virtuous and self-righteous, and their opinions are more valid because they are the oppressed group, right? So there's this entitlement that you get with a lot of contemporary feminists, and particularly the female ones, because they are told that as the result of them being a victim, they are entitled to behave in ways that actually aren't really acceptable for the general public, and they're allowed to say things and demonize others who criticize them as being discriminatory against them, even when there's it's very clear that that's not happening. If you defeat their logical argument, they'll fall back on it being a personal attack on them, and they love to use strategies like bigoteering. So the technique of deliberately claiming that somebody's argument is a product of a prejudice that they have, i.e., if you're a woman, okay, you disagree with me because you're a misogynist. It's not because you disagree with my argument and inability to reason and convince people. If you're arguing with a black person and you disagree with them, oh, it's because you're racist, not, again, because the argument that they're articulating isn't good enough. And it creates this very entitled mindset that also coincides with the fact that, as a whole, these girls and in society and men, not just the women, we have been pushed this narrative repeatedly that it is always women that are the disadvantaged ones, that everything is black and white, that it's a zero-sum game. It's a hangover from the past that we've got when we did live in genuinely more patriarchal systems where women were more disadvantaged, but we don't live in that way anymore. And you can see examples of how overlooked male inequality is. For example, during COVID, it was painted that women were more at risk from it when it wasn't. More men died and men were more at risk. If you look at the American Psychological Association's complete failure to recognize male psychology and specific problems years back, and instead actually demonizing men, like these significant institutions, policy that came through the US government, policy that's coming through the UK government now. If you look at what's being proposed with adolescence, and in Australia, similar thing, that you need to teach boys about toxic masculinity, a totally fictitious term that had almost no academic reference up until about the mid 2010s and then completely blew up in the face of popular culture. These kind of things, the positive discrimination schemes that women have got, like the advantages that women have got now in education, all of these things which we don't need to strip away necessarily, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other, but there is this overwhelmingly pro female narrative in society that people are terrified to admit, because it didn't used to be like that. The pendulum has very much swung the other way, and now we are seeing that swing back, and it possibly will go too far the other way again, particularly if people like Trump and Musk continue to have the dominant cultural influence in leading Western countries like the US. But still, we are moving away from the pendulum swing that had gone too far the other way, and there are still a lot of women, in particular feminist women, who hold on to this entitled victim and anti-male narrative that is legitimized as being okay because of the past and just general misinformation. And you can see this with the average feminist when you speak to them. They haven't got a fucking clue what they're talking about more often than not. Of course, there are the ones that do, but the average one doesn't. But they, again, like I said, with ego, they believe, they know that they are right. And it makes it very, very difficult. And it's why, like I said at the beginning, if you are a guy who's going to stand up for men or call out any of this bullshit that you see with contemporary feminism, you are inevitably going to be accused of being sexist, misogynist, patriarchal, any of these things, because it challenges the contemporary narrative, the status quo, and people are so afraid of doing that and the backlash. But fortunately, we can see that going the other way. And again, the reason that I make this video is because I do want to encourage you all, as men and as women, to stand up against this kind of corrupt ideological bullying that we see from these groups, whether it be left or right. And at the moment, I think it's necessary to do that against the left and the woke left as they lose more and more momentum and get pushed back on, so that we can restore that balance ultimately of appreciating femininity and masculinity as equally important things. But guys, that is my 15-minute rant straight over, and I'll see you in the next video.